everyone, welcome to Youth Bombs. I'm Craig.
I'm Olin.
I'm Carson.
And we're the voice of young conservatives in Alachua County, looking at President Trump's efforts to dismantle the Department of Education. Can he do it? What would it look like? We'll get into it. Holden, first off, do you think that the Department of Education should be abolished and efforts should be taken in that manner?
Well, I think everybody knows that my answer would be yes. The Department of Education should be abolished. The state teaching people or being involved in education is just not a good idea. And it would be very amazing to see the private sector get involved in that more than they already are right now. There's still a lot going on in the private sector still with education, but largely we have confiscatory education, obviously. But of course that's not going to change with dismantling the Department of Education at the federal level. I think the Department of Education has only been there since
the 70s?
Yeah, 70s or something like that, yeah. So, it has most of the vast majority of American history, we didn't have one. And even before public education, for most of public education's history, we had no Department of Education. So, I mean, the cost of education since the Department of Education has come in, it has just ballooned, and I'm not so sure that the quality of education is matching the costs involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Test scores for decades have remained roughly flat while spending has skyrocketed and numbers of administrators have gone way up. So, Carson, looking at the constitutionality and Trump's ability to do this, do you think that he should be able to dismantle the department, and do you understand what that might look like in practice?
Yeah, in practice, I will say, unless he's able to pass an act of Congress, which I'm not sure he has the votes for. I believe he only has about 30 or so votes in the Senate, and that would be where it really, I mean, not to say that their House majority isn't also incredibly slim, but with senators like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, I don't think he would have the votes. He would basically need all but two besides them to vote in favor of it. And I'm just not seeing that happening, especially when you have senators like Tom Tillis and Mitch McConnell, those kind of people who are a lot more moderate. I'm not certain it's going to happen. Now, as far as the constitutionality of it, I think there's a lot Trump could do with an executive order. He obviously couldn't completely abolish it, but he could probably downsize it a lot. So I think that's probably going to be his main effort. I don't know if that's what should happen. I don't know if the executive should have that much power. I feel like that's kind of a little crazy, just like having an executive that has that much power and that much ability to just do everything. And not to say I don't want the Department of Education to be dismantled. I think it's good policy. But I think of this always, what does it mean for our government first? And if a Democratic president, for instance, had that much power to just actively dismantle agencies or downsize them completely, or more likely, what would happen in practice is upsize them. I don't know. I think that's scary. I don't want to give the executive so much power over these agencies, even though they're a part of the executive branch. Frankly, I still want to keep it slim. But.
Yeah, no, gotcha. And I think something interesting to look out there is that the Department of Education has certain responsibilities delegated to it by the legislature. And as you said, President Trump probably would not be able to just abolish the department with a stroke of a pen, but he could take away a lot of its functions. And given that, if you take away the functions that aren't necessarily explicitly laid out by the bills authorizing the Department of Education, then that could be an effective and constitutional manner to downsize government. Do you agree?
Yes, yeah, I agree. I think overall, the Constitution, there are flaws with it, but overall, we need to respect it as much as humanly possible, even if we disagree with some of the outcomes of respecting it as much as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm. Right, it's absolutely our guideline for how things should and must run in the federal government. Holden, how would your approach to education look in this country without the Department of Education?
Well, I mean, my approach is of course, if it moves, privatize it, and if it doesn't move, privatize it, and because everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. So this is no different with education. I would love to make it so that education is a private market, and I mean a lot of it is daycare essentially. A lot of education today is daycare. Let's be honest. So, I mean, I would like to see that get more the private market more involved in it, and I would love to see that unleashed and entrepreneurs unleash on their ideas and what they think they could do to make it more effective and much better. And I think overall we would become much more literate as a result.
Okay. I think, there's certainly a lot of virtue to private education, and it can definitely outperform public schools, and it's a great option for a lot of students. But public education also provides the access that many wouldn't necessarily have if it didn't exist, because not everyone would be able to afford a private education, especially, for instance, people in rural areas may not be able to be served by private education, whereas public education guarantees that there will be a school for X number of students in that region. How would you address the potential shortcomings there with private education?
Well, how would you address giving people food who may not be able to afford the best food? You don't. The government doesn't do that. They shouldn't do that. At least they do in a lot of circumstances with SNAP programs. But the idea is that there's a market for selling to poor people. That's how Sam Walton got rich. He sold to lower class, generally, people. So, it's no different with education. They would just get lower quality education by and large. And also, you would get private markets, more private charities probably involved in that process, so that those kids could still get an education. I think even those kids would most likely get a better education than they get today, most likely. But it would take some time to get adjusted to that process, of course. But I would love to see it. I'd say that like if you ask Bernie Sanders, I think he asked RFKs, is healthcare a human right? And it's this is basically very similar, but not the same question. Is that, well, what about the kids? They should have a right to education. They don't have a right to an education. They have a right to property. And so that's it. No, you don't have a right to education. You don't have a right to the labor of another human being, which is an economic good takes labor to produce. So this is no different. It takes labor to produce. You don't have a claim on somebody else's labor.
That makes sense, though at the end of the day, I think we could run the risk of many people not having access in the first place, because you won't be able to have charities be able to go every single place that there are large or small quantities of poor individuals or rural individuals, whereas the government at least provides that mandate. Now, perhaps a middle ground could be where the government funds private institutions to do that, and thereby at least gets rid of more federal bureaucracy. But I don't see how you can target every single rural area or poor area in the country with private institutions.
I mean, perhaps you could have a transition period where you have a certain amount of money that's given to people so that they could choose themselves on what they want to do or whatnot. But generally speaking, you want to privatize as fast as possible. And when it comes to when the government's getting involved in all this, we have to remember that the first lesson of economics is scarcity. We have virtually infinite wants, but we can't satisfy them all, so we have to economize under scarcity. And so the government giving money to people, that capital is scarce. It's being taken out of the hands of an entrepreneur that could be creating something else that's filling the most urgent needs of consumers. So, it sounds great. Yes, the government is helping people, with education, and maybe there's some merit to that in the short term. But you have to take in the broader economic implications, which is that you're taking capital out of the economy, and now the government is allocating it. So it's generally not a good idea.
Gotcha. Carson, which approach do you more align with, and why?
Neither. I would say that I think that abolishing the Department of Education is good policy, but most of education, this is I think being lost in this conversation, most of education is handled at the local and state levels. So if we want a society, frankly, my goal is always, let's downsize the federal government, right? The federal government is far too big, but I think that state and local programs aren't always necessarily terrible. So I think having a more localist policy approach, where maybe a little bit of education is handled at the state level, and a lot more of it is handled at the local level, I think would be a lot better. Because I think, honestly, for the average person, they just want options. So if you have the option to live somewhere where education is provided, and you have the option to live somewhere where it isn't, you have the option to, generally, if something's being handled at the local level, it's going to contribute more to your local economy. And I think having that option, rather than just having your tax dollars be sent, I believe the Department of Education has around a $100 billion budget, maybe slightly less than that, and having the option to say, I don't want my tax dollars being sent all across the country, but maybe my tax dollars can be sent, 10 minutes down the street. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, and I don't think that most Americans would disagree with that.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of benefit to having that local control because it's closer to the parents, the students, and they can have more influence. And I also agree with the idea of getting rid of the Department of Education. It is certainly unnecessary, and we have seen poor results given that spending is skyrocketed and test results are flat. It's not helping the students. Any closing thoughts from either of you?
Hey, simply put, whenever we're talking about fiscal policy, the government spending money, they're taking money out of the economy. They're taking capital out of the economy, which is scarce. So, are you okay with that? Like, are you okay with the fact that the government is going to do worse than the private sector, and they're going to tax, which is confiscatory, which raises time preference? So, generally speaking, you want to just privatize as fast as possible. I agree with Carson that it would be better for the local governments to do that than the state governments. Generally speaking, you don't want your tax dollars going somewhere in the middle of Tennessee or Kansas or something when you're in Florida, or or the like. So yeah, I mean, I'm more sympathetic to that than what we have now, but at the same time, the end goal should be to privatize.
Gotcha. Any closing thoughts, Carson?
Yeah, I just think that generally, I'm going to reiterate everything I've said. Everything is done better at the local level than the federal level. It makes more sense. People are more okay with being taxed if it's going to go to something locally than federally. And I also want to hammer home something, a point Holden made, which is that even if we were to privatize everything, I think that a lot of people would just go to charities. I mean, you already have, a lot of qualified people who cannot afford to go to college, who just get scholarships and then go to college that way. So I think, there's also this understated value of charity. I think charity would definitely happen. Or you could even have programs where, for instance, a business invests in you to go to college, or to go to high school, which already exists, and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of different things that would happen. I mean, a lot of different local programs too. Even if we did have a fully private education system, you might have a local government who sends you to school somehow. So it's like, there's just a lot of different things that could happen that I'm not necessarily totally opposed to the idea, or at least I'm opposed to it, but I don't think it's as bad as some people would want to say it is.
Gotcha. Yeah, certainly a lot of options out there. But that being said, thanks everyone so much for watching. We really appreciate it. We upload 3 times a week. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And feel free to email us at youthbombs@alatrorepublicans.com. Thanks so much, everyone.